Picture a grand opera premiere in the quaint village of St. Mary Mead, where the radiant soprano Elena Varelli collapses mid-aria, poisoned by a sip from her silver flask. As the curtain falls on her life, Miss Jane Marple, a sharp-eyed spinster, unravels a web of ambition, envy, and obsession. The suspects: a driven director, a jealous co-star, a loyal assistant, and a fanatical devotee. With clues like a smudged flask, torn silk, and a cryptic ticket stub, Miss Marple exposes the chilling truth. The understudy Clara Beaumont poisoned Eleanor to steal her spotlight. In this Agatha Christie-inspired tale, secrets unravel, and justice takes centre stage. Chapter 1. The curtain rises. The Theatre Royal in St. Mary Mead was a blaze of light and expectation. Its gilded arches and crimson draperies aglow under the chandeliers. It was the premiere of La Voce d'Ombra, a new opera touted as a masterpiece, and the air thrummed with the excitement of the well-heeled crowd. Miss Jane Marple, ensconced in a cushioned box seat near the stage, adjusted her lace shawl and peered through her tortoiseshell spectacles at the sea of faces below. Her nephew, Raymond West, had persuaded her to attend, insisting that her sharp eye for human nature would find the evening's spectacle as intriguing offstage as on. "Aunt Jane," he'd said with a grin, "you'll spot something nobody else will. Mark my words." Miss Marple, ever indulgent of Raymond's enthusiasms, had agreed, though she privately preferred the quieter dramas of her village. The orchestra tuned their instruments, a discordant hum rising like a swarm of bees, and the audience settled into a hush. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the programme in her lap, its elegant script announcing Madame Elena Varelli as the lead soprano, a diva whose voice was said to rival the angels. Elena's portrait, printed in stark black and white, revealed a woman of striking beauty. Dark eyes, high cheekbones, and a cascade of raven hair. Miss Marple noted the faint arrogance in her pose, a tilt of the chin that reminded her of Mrs. Eldridge, the St. Mary Mead choir mistress, whose pride in her contralto had sparked many a village feud. The lights dimmed, and the overture began, a haunting melody that wove through the theatre like a silken thread. The curtain rose to reveal a moonlit Venetian palazzo, its painted columns shimmering under the stage lights. Elena Varelli emerged, resplendent in a gown of sapphire silk, her presence commanding the vast stage. Her voice, when it soared, was liquid gold, each note precise yet alive with passion. Miss Marple, no connoisseur of opera but attuned to the rhythms of human emotion, sensed the audience's rapture. She glanced at her neighbours, a portly gentleman dabbing his eyes, a young woman clutching her pearls, and felt a flicker of satisfaction. Art, she mused, could move even the stoniest hearts. Yet, as the first act neared its climax, a discordant note intruded. Elena, mid-aria, faltered. Her hand flew to her throat, her eyes widened in a flash of panic, and her voice broke into a strangled gasp. She swayed, her sapphire gown pooling around her like spilled ink, and collapsed onto the stage. A collective gasp rose from the audience, followed by a stunned silence. The orchestra stumbled to a halt, and the curtain descended with a heavy thud, as if sealing a tomb. Whispers erupted, sharp and urgent, as ushers hurried down the aisles. Miss Marple sat very still, her knitting untouched in her lap, her mind already sifting through the moment. She had seen the flicker of something unnatural in Elena's fall, a rigidity that spoke not of fainting, but of something far graver. Below, a woman's scream pierced the murmurs, and the house lights flared. Miss Marple leaned forward, observing the chaos. A man in evening dress, likely the director, she thought, rushed onto the stage, his gestures theatrical yet frantic. A young woman, clad in a costume mirroring Elena's, hovered nearby, her face pale but her eyes oddly bright. A bespectacled man, clutching a clipboard, darted between them, his movements those of one accustomed to serving rather than leading. And in the front row, a woman in a dowdy coat clutched a bouquet of roses, her face a mask of anguish. Miss Marple's lips pursed. She knew the signs of tragedy, having seen them in the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead, where a poisoned tongue or a hidden grudge could unravel lives as surely as any grand stage. Raymond, seated beside her, whispered, "Aunt Jane, do you think she's—" But Miss Marple raised a delicate hand, silencing him. "We shall see, Raymond," she said softly, her voice calm, but her eyes sharp as needles. Already her mind was at work, piecing together the fragments of what she had seen. The diva's collapse, the fleeting expressions of those around her, the weight of an evening gone terribly wrong. In St. Mary Mead, she had learned that death, when it came, was rarely an accident. And as the theatre buzzed with fear and speculation, Miss Jane Marple knew that this premiere, so full of promise, had opened not with triumph, but with murder. Chapter 2. A Death in the Spotlight. The Theatre Royal, moments ago a temple of art and anticipation, had transformed into a cauldron of confusion. The heavy velvet curtain, drawn hastily across the stage, muffled the gasps and murmurs of the audience, but backstage a different drama unfolded, one of panic, suspicion, and the sharp tang of tragedy. Miss Jane Marple, still seated in her box, observed the scene with the quiet intensity of a hawk, her knitting needles idle in her lap, her mind racing. The sudden collapse of Madame Elena Varelli, the celebrated soprano, was no mere fainting spell. Miss Marple's instincts, honed by years of unravelling Saint, Mary Mead's small but sinister secrets, told her this was something far darker. Below, the stage manager, a burly man with a voice like gravel, bellowed for order, but his commands were drowned by the clamour of actors, stagehands, and musicians. The orchestra pit, visible from Miss Marple's vantage point, was a tangle of abandoned instruments, the violinist's bows lying like fallen arrows. A young soprano, still in her Venetian costume, wept openly, her mascara streaking her cheeks, while a tenor in a powdered wig muttered to himself, pacing the wings. Miss Marple's eyes, however, were drawn to the cluster of figures near the stage's centre, where Elena's body lay, a sapphire pool against the polished boards. Dr. Haydock, a familiar figure from St. Mary Mead, had been in the audience and now knelt beside Elena, his face grim. Miss Marple noted his quick, practised movements as he examined the body, his fingers probing for a pulse, his nose wrinkling slightly. She knew that look, doctor. Haydock was no stranger to death, and his expression suggested he had already formed a theory. A moment later he rose, brushing his knees, and signalled to a nearby usher. "Fetch the police," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that silenced the nearest onlookers. "And someone find Inspector Craddock." Miss Marple's lips curved faintly. Inspector Craddock, another saint? Mary Mead acquaintance was a man of sense and diligence, though she often found his methods a trifle plodding. She had no doubt he would welcome her observations, as he had in the past when village scandals turned deadly. For now, she remained in her box content to watch the tableau unfold, her mind cataloguing every gesture, every glance. Raymond West, her nephew, leaned close, his voice low with excitement. "Aunt Jane, this is dreadful. Do you think it's, well, you know, murder?" "Hush, Raymond," Miss Marple murmured, her tone gentle but firm. "We mustn't jump to conclusions. But we mustn't ignore what's before us either." Her eyes, bright behind her spectacles, scanned the stage, where 4 figures stood out amid the chaos. The director, the co-star, the assistant, and the fan. Each, she sensed, held a piece of the puzzle, and she intended to fit them together. The director, Victor Grayson, was a wiry man in his 40s, his black tie askew, his hands flailing as he issued orders no one heeded. His angular face, lit by the harsh backstage lamps, bore the strain of a man whose carefully laid plans had collapsed. Miss Marple recalled Raymond's gossip about Victor, a rising star in the theatre world, known for his relentless ambition and a temper that flared when crossed. He had staked his reputation on La Voce d'Ombra, and Elena's performance was to be its crowning glory. Now, with her sprawled lifeless at his feet, his dream seemed to crumble. Yet, Miss Marple noted, his eyes darted not to Elena, but to the wings, where a young woman stood, her posture rigid with something other than grief. That woman was Clara Beaumont, Elena's co-star and understudy, a striking brunette whose beauty rivaled the fallen divas. Clad in a costume nearly identical to Elena's, save for its emerald hue, Clara stood apart, her arms crossed, her lips pressed into a thin line. Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the flicker of her gaze, not toward Elena, but towards the audience, as if gauging their reaction. Clara's role in the opera was secondary, but with Elena gone, she would step into the spotlight. Miss Marple thought of Miss Carter, a saint, Mary Mead's seamstress, who had once undermined a rival to secure a church bazaar commission. Ambition, she knew, could wear a mournful mask. Nearby, Thomas Reed, Elena's assistant, knelt by the body, his hands trembling as he clutched a silk scarf, perhaps one of Elena's props. A quiet man in his 30s, with wire-rimmed glasses and a neatly pressed suit, Thomas exuded the air of one accustomed to fading into the background. Yet his face, pale and drawn, betrayed a deeper distress. Miss Marple wondered at his devotion. Had it been rewarded or rebuffed? She recalled Mr. Thompson, a St. Mary Mead gardener whose loyalty to his employer soured into resentment when his efforts went unacknowledged. Thomas's grief seemed genuine, but grief, Miss Marple knew, could hide many sins. The 4th figure, hovering at the edge of the stage, was Lillian Marsh, a woman in her late 40s, her plain coat and sensible shoes at odds with the theatre's opulence. She clutched a bouquet of wilting roses, her eyes fixed on Elena with an intensity that bordered on reverence. Raymond had mentioned Lillian earlier, a devoted fan who followed Elena's career with near-religious fervour, attending every performance, sending gifts and writing fervent letters. Miss Marple's mind flicked to Mrs. Pike, a St. Mary Mead widow whose obsession with the vicar had led to reckless acts, though none fatal. Lillian's adoration was palpable, but was it harmless? Inspector Craddock arrived, his tall frame cutting through the crowd with authority. His grey eyes swept the scene, taking in the body, the suspects and the chaos. He spotted Miss Marple in her box and gave a slight nod, a gesture that spoke of their shared history. She returned a faint smile, knowing he would seek her counsel soon enough. For now, Craddock turned to Doctor Haydock, who drew him aside, speaking in low tones. Miss Marple strained to catch their words, but she needed no confirmation to suspect poison. The almond-like scent Doctor. Haydock had noticed the rigidity of Elena's collapse. These were signs she had encountered in books, if not in life. A St. Mary Mead chemist, Mr. Hargreaves had once described cyanide's effects in lurid detail, and Miss Marple's memory was as sharp as ever. Craddock began organising the scene, directing constables to secure the exits and keep the audience seated. He approached the cluster of suspects, his notebook already open. "Nobody leaves until I've spoken with you," he said, his voice calm but unyielding. Victor Grayson protested, gesturing wildly. "This is a disaster! The press will crucify me!" Craddock's eyebrow lifted, and Miss Marple noted the director's focus on his reputation rather than Elena's fate. Clara Beaumont, meanwhile, offered a trembling, "It's so awful," but her eyes remained dry, her posture composed. Thomas Reed said nothing, his gaze fixed on the floor, while Lillian Marsh clutched her roses tighter, whispering she was perfection. Miss Marple, invited by Craddock to join him backstage, descended from her box with care, her black lace-up shoes silent on the carpeted stairs. Raymond followed, his curiosity barely contained, but she waved him back. "Stay here, dear," she said. "I shan't be long." Backstage, the air was thick with the scent of grease paint and sawdust, overlaid with that faint, sinister almond note. Elena's body had been covered with a cloth, but her sapphire gown peeked out, a stark reminder of the evening's promise. Miss Marple stood near Craddock, her small figure unobtrusive, yet her presence seemed to steady the inspector. Dr. Haydock, wiping his hands on a handkerchief, confirmed his suspicion. "Cyanide, I'd wager," he said quietly. "Fast-acting, deadly." She was gone within moments. He pointed to Elena's lips, now faintly blue beneath the stage makeup. "The flask she drank from during the act. It's on the prop table." "I'd start there." Craddock nodded, retrieving the silver flask with a gloved hand. Miss Marple peered at it, noting its ornate engraving and the slight smudge on its rim, as if someone had handled it carelessly. She filed the detail away, her mind turning to the village postmistress, Miss Weatherby, whose smudged envelopes had once revealed a thief. Craddock began questioning the suspects, his tone measured but probing. Victor Grayson, still agitated, claimed he'd been in the lighting booth during the performance, overseeing the cues. "I saw nothing," he insisted, though his fingers twitched, betraying nerves. Clara Beaumont said she'd been in the wings, preparing for her entrance, and had noticed Elena sipping from the flask. "She always drank before her big aria," Clara said, her voice soft but steady. Miss Marple noted the precision of her words, as if rehearsed. Thomas Reed admitted to filling the flask with water that morning, as was his habit, but swore it had been untouched since. His hands, Miss Marple observed, were calloused, suggesting a life of practical tasks, not cunning. Lillian Marsh, when questioned, stammered that she'd been in the audience, her eyes never leaving Eleanor. "I wouldn't hurt her," she whispered, her voice breaking. "She was my light." Miss Marple, standing quietly, let the suspect's words wash over her. Each voice carried its own cadence, its own secrets. Victor's bluster, Clara's composure, Thomas's reticence, Lillian's fervour, they reminded her of St. Mary Mead's. Villagers, whose quarrels over garden fences or church teas often hid deeper motives. She thought of Mrs. Eldridge again, whose rivalry with a fellow singer had led to a tampered hymn book, a petty act that hinted at darker possibilities. Here the stakes were higher, the stage grander, but human nature, Miss Marple knew, remained the same. Craddock, finishing his initial questions, turned to Miss Marple. "Well, Miss Marple," he said, a hint of a smile in his voice, "any thoughts?" She tilted her head, her eyes twinkling. "Only that we must look closely, Inspector. The truth is often in the smallest things, a glance, a gesture, a smudge." She gestured vaguely toward the flask, and Craddock's smile widened. He knew better than to dismiss her, for Miss Marple's small things had solved cases that baffled Scotland Yard. As the constables began ushering the audience out, their statements taken, Miss Marple lingered, her gaze sweeping the stage. The prop table held a jumble of items, glasses, a dagger, a fan, but the flask stood out, its silver surface gleaming under the lights. She noted its position slightly askew, as if placed in haste. The backstage door, half hidden behind a flat, caught her eye next. It led to an alley, she recalled from Raymond's chatter about the theatre's layout. An unlocked door, a fleeting visitor. Such things had unravelled mysteries in Sion, Mary Mead. She thought of a stolen bicycle, traced to a muddy footprint near a back gate. Here the clues were less tangible, but no less telling. The suspects dispersed, each under orders to remain available. Victor stormed off to his office, muttering about the press. Clara retreated to her dressing room, her steps light despite the tragedy. Thomas lingered, his eyes on Elena's covered form, until a constable gently urged him away. Lillian, still clutching her roses, was escorted out, her sobs echoing in the corridor. Miss Marple watched them go, her mind weaving a tapestry of motives, ambition, envy, loyalty, obsession. Each thread led somewhere, but where? She returned to her box, where Raymond waited, his face alight with questions. "Well, Aunt Jane, is it murder?" Miss Marple settled into her seat, her knitting resumed, the needles clicking softly. "I fear so, Raymond," she said, her voice soft but certain, "but we shall find the truth." "We always do." Her eyes, bright and unyielding, returned to the stage, where the shadow of Elena Varelli's death hung heavy. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had learned that no secret could hide forever. And in the Theatre Royal, she intended to prove it once more. Chapter 3. The Director's Vision, the morning after the tragedy at the Theatre Royal. St. Mary Mead awoke to a grey drizzle that mirrored the sombre mood. Miss Jane Marple sat in the tea-room across from the theatre, her hands folded around a steaming cup of Darjeeling, her eyes fixed on the grand facade where last night's glamour had given way to grim reality. The tea-room, with its lace curtains and chintz tablecloths, was a haven of familiarity, not unlike her own parlour. And it offered a perfect vantage point to observe the comings and goings at the theatre's entrance. Inspector Craddock had promised to keep her informed, but Miss Marple preferred to gather her own impressions, much as she did when untangling the petty jealousies of her village. The theatre's doors were locked. A constable stationed outside, his collar turned up against the rain. Inside, she knew, the investigation continued, but Miss Marple's thoughts were on Victor Grayson, the director of La Voce d'Ombre. His theatrical outburst last night, more concerned with the press than with Eleanor Varelli's death, had struck her as revealing. She recalled Mr. Elwood, the St. Mary Mead grocer, whose bluster about a rival's spoiled milk hid his own tampering. Victor's ambition, she suspected, might conceal a similar guilt. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind drifting to the previous evening's chaos. Victor had been a whirlwind of energy, his sharp features illuminated by the backstage lamps, his voice rising above the din as he lamented the ruin of his opera. Yet his eyes, darting to the wings where Clara Beaumont stood, suggested a man less grieved than calculating. Raymond, ever eager for gossip, had shared that Victor's career hung on this production. A triumph could secure him a place among London's elite directors. A failure, or worse, a scandal, might end him. Elena, by all accounts, had been difficult, insisting on her artistic vision over Victor's. Miss Marple wondered if such a clash could drive a man to desperate measures. The tea-room door jingled, and Victor himself entered, shaking rain from his overcoat. He was a slight man, his dark hair slicked back, his movements quick and bird-like. He scanned the room, his gaze settling on Miss Marple with a flicker of recognition. She had, after all, been introduced by Craddock as a consultant last night. He approached her table, his smile strained but practiced. "Miss Marple, isn't it?" he said, his voice smooth despite the tension in his jaw. "May I join you?" "Of course, Mr. Grayson," she replied, gesturing to the chair opposite. Her tone was gentle, her eyes keen, like those of a kindly aunt who misses nothing. Victor sat, ordering a coffee with a wave to the waitress, and launched into a monologue about the tragedy. Elena was irreplaceable, he declared, his hands gesturing expansively. My vision for La Voce d'Ombra depended on her voice, her presence. This is a catastrophe, not just for me, but for art itself. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, her knitting produced from her bag, the needles clicking softly. A great loss, indeed, she murmured. I understand you and Madame Varelli worked closely together. Her question was mild, but her gaze was sharp, noting the brief tightening of Victor's chipoxichot lips. Oh yes, he said, leaning back. She was my muse, you see. We spent hours refining her performance. Every gesture, every note, it had to be perfect. His voice carried a rehearsed passion, but Miss Marple caught a hint of strain, as if he were reciting lines. She thought of Mr. Jenkins, the St. Mary Mead choirmaster, whose effusive praise for a singer often masked his frustration with her demands. Victor's fervour, she suspected, hid a similar discord. Yet, Miss Marple ventured, her tone as delicate as her lace shawl, I've heard Madame Varelli had strong opinions about the opera. Did you always see eye to eye? Her question hung in the air, innocent yet probing, and Victor's fingers paused on his coffee cup. He laughed a touch too loudly. Artists clash, Miss Marple. It's the nature of creation. Elena wanted a certain aria sung her way, slower, more emotive. I preferred a brisker tempo to suit the drama. We argued, yes, but it was professional, never personal. His eyes flicked to the window, avoiding hers, and Miss Marple's needles paused. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead seamstress Miss Carter, whose professional disputes with a rival had led to a slashed gown. Arguments, she knew, could escalate. I see, she said, her voice soothing. And last night, where were you when Madame Varelli collapsed? Her question was casual, as if asking about the weather, but her eyes missed nothing. The slight twitch of Victor's mouth, the way his fingers tightened on the cup. In the lighting booth, he said quickly. "I was overseeing the cues for the first act. The stage manager can confirm it." His tone was firm, but Miss Marple noted the speed of his reply, as if he'd anticipated the question. She smiled, her expression benign, and changed the subject to the opera's set design, letting Victor relax, but her mind was busy, sifting his words, his gestures. The lighting booth was high above the stage, offering a clear view but little access to the props, like the flask from which Eleanor had drunk. Yet Victor's ambition, his need for control, made him a figure to watch. As Victor prattled on about his artistic vision, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the flask, now in Craddock's possession. Its silver surface, smudged and gleaming, held secrets, she was sure. She recalled a St. Mary Mead incident, a poisoned jar of jam traced to a jealous neighbour through a smudged fingerprint. Victor's alibi, she mused, would need checking, but more than that, she needed to understand his heart. Was he a man who would kill to protect his dream, or merely one caught in its wreckage? The tea-room door opened again, admitting a gust of damp air, and Inspector Craddock himself. He spotted Miss Marple and Victor, his grey eyes narrowing slightly. "Miss Marple," he said, approaching, "I thought I might find you here." His tone held a mix of respect and amusement, for he knew her habit of appearing where clues gathered. To Victor he said, "Mr. Grayson, I'll need you at the theatre later. We're examining the dressing rooms." Victor's face paled, but he nodded, rising with a flourish. "Of course, Inspector." Anything to help. He bid Miss Marple a theatrical farewell and left, his coat flapping as he stepped into the rain. Craddock took his seat, ordering tea, and leaned toward Miss Marple. "What do you make of him?" he asked, his voice low. "A man of passion," she replied, her needles clicking again. "But passion can be dangerous, Inspector." "In St. Mary Mead, I knew a man, Mr. Elwood, the grocer, who loved his shop as Mr. Grayson loves his opera. When a rival threatened his trade, he acted unwisely." She left the implication hanging, and Craddock's lips twitched in a smile. "You think Grayson's hiding something?" he asked. "I think," she said softly, "that he cares more for his opera than for Madame Varelli. And that is a motive worth exploring." She sipped her tea, her eyes distant. "Have you tested the flask yet?" Craddock nodded. "Sent to the lab this morning. We'll know soon if it's cyanide, as Haydock suspects. But the dressing room's a mess. Anyone could have tampered with it. Grayson, Clara Beaumont, Thomas Reed, even that fan, Miss Marsh. They all had access." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Access, yes, but motive, Inspector, that's the key, and motive lies in the heart, not the hands." She thought of Victor's darting eyes, his quick alibi, and the tension between him and Elena. She thought, too, of Clara, waiting in the wings, and Thomas with his quiet devotion, and Lillian with her fervent adoration. Each heart held a secret, and Miss Marple intended to uncover them. As Craddock shared details of the investigation, the flask's smudge, the unlocked alley door, Miss Marple listened, her mind weaving connections. The theatre, like St. Mary Mead, was a village of its own, full of rivalries and desires. Victor Grayson's vision, she sensed, was a thread in this tapestry, but whether it led to murder remained to be seen. For now, she finished her tea, her knitting a soft rhythm in the quiet tea-room, and prepared to watch the next act of this deadly drama unfold. Chapter 4. The Co-Star's Ambition. The drizzle had lifted by noon, leaving St. Mary Mead's cobbled streets glistening under a weak sun. Miss Jane Marple, having left the tea-room, made her way to the Theatre Royal's side entrance, where Inspector Craddock had arranged for her to view the dressing rooms. Her black umbrella, now furled, tapped lightly against her side as she walked, her steps measured but purposeful. The theatre loomed ahead, its grandeur muted by the police tape fluttering across the alley door. Miss Marple's mind, ever active, turned to Clara Beaumont, the understudy whose poised demeanour last night had struck her as curiously unyielding, like a St. Mary Mead schoolmistress, hiding a grudge behind a prim smile. Clara, with her emerald gown and striking features, had stood in the wings as Elena Varelli collapsed, her expression a careful blend of shock and sorrow. Yet Miss Marple, attuned to the subtleties of human nature, had noted the dryness of Clara's eyes, the calculated tilt of her head as she faced the murmuring audience. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had known young women like Clara. Betty, the baker's apprentice, came to mind, who sabotaged a rival's cake to win a village contest, her tears as false as her victory was fleeting. Clara's ambition, Miss Marple suspected, burned brighter than her grief. And ambition, she knew, could be a deadly spark. Inside the theatre, the air was cool and heavy with the scent of old wood and velvet. Craddock met her at the stage door, his face lined with the fatigue of a sleepless night. "Miss Marple," he greeted, tipping his hat. "The dressing rooms are this way. We've kept them as they were. Elena's and Clara's are side by side." His tone held a note of deference, for he valued her insights, however gently offered. Miss Marple followed, her eyes scanning the narrow corridor lined with faded posters of past productions. The theatre, she thought, was a world of illusions, where truth hid behind painted masks. Elena's dressing room was a shrine to her stardom. A gilded mirror framed by light bulbs, a vase of lilies wilting in the corner, and a rack of glittering costumes. The silver flask, now gone to the lab, had sat on the vanity, Craddock said, alongside a clutter of makeup brushes and a half-empty bottle of almond liqueur, a gift, he noted, from Lillian Marsh. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the vanity, noting the precise arrangement of items, as if Eleanor had been meticulous even in chaos. She thought of Mrs. Hargreaves, the St. Mary Mead chemist's wife, whose tidy desk once concealed a stolen prescription. Order, Miss Marple knew, could mask deceit. Clara's dressing room, by contrast, was Spartan, with a single mirror and a folding chair. A script lay open on the table, its margins filled with neat penciled notes. Miss Marple peered at them, her spectacles catching the light. The notes detailed stage directions, but one page bore a single underlined word: timing. She filed it away, her mind flickering to a saint, Mary Mead seamstress, whose precise stitches hid a pilfered spool of thread. Clara's discipline, she sensed, was a clue in itself. Craddock, watching her, said, "Clara's due here soon." "I asked her to walk us through her movements last night." Miss Marple nodded, settling into a chair, her knitting produced from her bag. The soft click of her needles filled the silence as they waited. Clara arrived promptly, her dark hair swept into a chignon, her navy dress understated but elegant. She carried herself with the grace of a performer, but her smile, Miss Marple noted, was a shade too polished, like a saint. Mary Mead debutante, masking nerves at a dance. "Inspector, Miss Marple," Clara said, her voice smooth as velvet. "How dreadful this all is." Elena would a friend. The word faltered slightly, and Miss Marple's needles paused. She recalled Betty's claim of friendship with her rival, belied by a spiteful glance. Clara's tone held a similar dissonance. "Indeed," Miss Marple said kindly, her eyes gentle but piercing. "You must be devastated, Miss Beaumont. To lose a colleague so suddenly, and on such a night." Her words were sympathetic, but her gaze missed nothing. The faint tightening of Clara's jaw, the quick glance toward the vanity. Craddock, notebook in hand, took the lead. "Miss Beaumont, you said you were in the wings during the first act. Did you see anyone near Elena's flask?" His tone was brisk, but Miss Marple noted his deference to her presence, allowing her to observe uninterrupted. Clara shook her head, her expression mournful. "No, Inspector." I was focused on my cues. Elena always drank from her flask before her aria. It was a ritual. I didn't think anything of it. Her hands clasped tightly, the knuckles whitening, and Miss Marple's mind flashed to a saint. Mary Mead girl, whose clenched fists betrayed a lie about a stolen brooch. "And your relationship with Madame Varelli?" Miss Marple asked, her voice soft as a lullaby. "You worked so closely after all." She resumed knitting, the needles a steady rhythm, as if her question were mere chatter. Clara hesitated, then smiled faintly. "We were professionals." She was the star, of course, but I learned so much from her. We had our differences, what singers don't, but nothing serious. Her words were smooth, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of her eyes toward Elena's dressing room, as if drawn to the ghost of her rival. Craddock pressed further, asking about Clara's movements before the performance. She described preparing in her dressing room, reviewing her lines and joining the cast in the wings. "I handled the flask once, during rehearsal," she admitted, her voice steady. "Elena asked me to pass it to her. That's all." Miss Marple's needles paused again. The admission was too quick, too practiced, like a saint. Mary Mead's shop girl, explaining a missing coin with rehearsed innocence. As Craddock jotted notes, Miss Marple rose, her small frame moving to the vanity. She peered at a small mirror, its edge smudged with fingerprints. "Such a busy place, a theatre," she mused aloud, as if to herself. "So many hands touching things, flasks, props, doors. It's a wonder anything stays in place." Her tone was vague, but her glance at Clara was sharp, catching the younger woman's sudden stillness. Clara's smile faltered. "Yes, it's chaotic backstage," she said, recovering quickly. "But we all have our routines." She moved toward the door, as if eager to leave, but Craddock stopped her with a question about the alley door. "Did you notice it open last night?" he asked. Clara shook her head. "I never go near it. It's for stagehands, not performers." Her answer was firm, but Miss Marple noted the slight flush on her cheeks, like a saint. Mary Mead girl caught sneaking into a neighbour's garden. She filed the observation away, her mind turning to the flask's smudge, the alley's accessibility, and Clara's poised ambition. Craddock dismissed Clara, who left with a graceful nod, her footsteps echoing in the corridor. He turned to Miss Marple, his brow raised. "What do you think?" he asked, his voice low. Miss Marple folded her knitting, her expression thoughtful. "She's a careful young woman, Inspector. Careful in her words, her looks, her actions. But careful people sometimes make mistakes, when they try too hard to seem innocent. She thought of Betty, whose perfect alibi unravelled when a crumb of stolen cake was found on her apron. Miss Beaumont wants the role Elena had. That much is clear. Whether she'd kill for it, that we must discover. Craddock nodded, his eyes on the vanity. The lab results should come soon. If Clara's fingerprints are on that flask, beyond what she admitted, we'll have questions. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her mind already weaving the threads of Clara's story. Ambition, she knew, was a fire that could warm or destroy, and Clara's burned brightly. In St. Mary Mead, she had seen such fires flare into petty cruelties. Could Clara's have blazed into murder? As they left the dressing-room, Miss Marple glanced at the alley door, its lock rusted and loose. She thought of a saint. Mary Mead burglary, solved by a splintered gate that betrayed a thief's entry. The theatre, like her village, held its secrets in plain sight, and Clara Beaumont, with her polished grief and hidden glances, was a secret Miss Marple intended to unravel. Chapter 5. The Assistant's Devotion. The Theatre Royal stood silent under a sky bruised with clouds, its grand arches casting long shadows across St. Mary Mead's damp streets. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her modest parlour that afternoon, sipped a cup of chamomile tea, her knitting a soft rhythm in her hands. The morning's visit to the theatre lingered in her mind, particularly the quiet figure of Thomas Reed, Elena Varelli's assistant, whose trembling hands and downcast eyes had spoken of a grief more genuine than Clara Beaumont's polished tears. Miss Marple, ever attuned to the undercurrents of human nature, sensed that Thomas's devotion to Elena held secrets, perhaps not of guilt, but of a loyalty tested by unseen strains. She recalled Mr. Thompson, the St. Mary Mead gardener, whose quiet service to his employer hid a wound that festered into spite. Thomas, she suspected, was a man worth understanding. Inspector Craddock had invited her to meet Thomas at the police station, where he was to give a formal statement. Miss Marple, her black shawl draped over her, shoulders arrived promptly, her umbrella tucked under her arm despite the clearing sky. The station, a squat brick building, hummed with the quiet efficiency of routine, but Craddock's office held an air of urgency. He greeted her with a nod, his grey eyes weary but alert. "Miss Marple," he said, "Thomas Reed's waiting. He's nervous, keeps asking about the flask. I thought you might pick up something I miss." Miss Marple smiled faintly, settling into a chair by the window, her knitting bag at her side. "Nervous people often reveal more than they intend, Inspector," she said, her voice soft as a whisper. "In Saint. Mary Mead, I've found the quiet ones bear watching, for their silences speak volumes." Craddock's lips twitched, accustomed to her cryptic wisdom, and he ushered Thomas in. Thomas Reed entered, his slight frame stooped, his wire-rimmed glasses slipping down his nose. His suit, though neatly pressed, was worn at the cuffs, suggesting a life of modest means. His hands, calloused and ink-stained, fidgeted with a handkerchief, and his eyes, red-rimmed, avoided the inspector's gaze. Miss Marple noted his pallor, the faint tremor in his fingers, and thought of a saint. Mary Mead Clark, whose nervous habits betrayed a theft he never confessed. Thomas, she sensed, carried a burden, but whether it was guilt or sorrow remained unclear. "Mr. Reed," Craddock began, his tone firm but not unkind, "you've said you filled Madame Varelli's flask with water yesterday morning. Can you walk us through it again?" He leaned forward, notebook open, pencil poised. Thomas nodded, his voice low and halting. "Yes, sir." It was my routine. Every performance day, I'd fill Elena's, Madame Varelli's, flask with spring water from the green room. She insisted on it, said it soothed her throat. I checked it was clean, filled it, and left it on her vanity. That was around 10 o'clock. His fingers twisted the handkerchief, and Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, a counterpoint to his unease. And after that, Craddock pressed, "Did you see anyone near the flask?" Thomas shook his head, his glasses catching the light. "No, sir. I was busy with her costumes, her schedule. The dressing room was crowded, stage hands, singers, Mr. Grayson giving orders. I didn't notice anything unusual." His voice cracked, and he looked down, as if the memory of Elena's collapse overwhelmed him. Miss Marple, her eyes gentle behind her spectacles, spoke softly. "You were very devoted to Madame Varelli, Mr. Reed. It must have been a great responsibility, attending to her needs." Her tone was kind, almost maternal, but her gaze was sharp, catching the flicker of pain in his expression. "I was," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She was extraordinary. Not just her voice, but her spirit. She trusted me with everything, her letters, her rehearsals, her life." He paused, his hands stilling, and Miss Marple noted the weight of that word, life. She thought of Mr. Thompson again, whose devotion to his employer soured when she dismissed his efforts. Had Elena, in her stardom, wounded Thomas's quiet loyalty? "And was she always kind to you?" Miss Marple asked, her needles pausing. Her question was delicate, as if inquiring about a neighbour's health, but it hung in the air like a dart. Thomas's face flushed, and he adjusted his glasses. "She was busy," he said carefully. "Lately, she'd been distant." "The pressure of the premiere, I suppose. She snapped at me once or twice about a late letter, a wrinkled gown, but it was nothing." His voice faltered, and Miss Marple's mind flickered to a saint. Mary Mead maid, who, spurned by her mistress, had slipped a bitter herb into her tea, not fatal, but telling. Craddock, sensing the shift, leaned in. "Distant, you say? Did she confide in anyone else? Miss Beaumont, perhaps?" His question was sharp, probing for cracks in Thomas's story. Thomas shook his head, his eyes on the floor. "Not Clara. They weren't close. Elena kept to herself, mostly. She said Clara was too eager." His voice held a faint edge, and Miss Marple's needles resumed, her mind noting the hint of resentment. Clara's ambition, it seemed, was no secret even to Thomas. "And the flask," Miss Marple said, her tone light, as if musing aloud. "You handled it often, I imagine. Such a lovely thing, all engraved. Easy to misplace, perhaps, or for someone to tamper with?" Her question was vague, but her eyes locked on Thomas's, catching the sudden stillness in his frame. I don't know," he stammered. "I left it on the vanity like always." "Anyone could have touched it." His hands twisted the handkerchief again, and Miss Marple thought of a saint. Mary Mead boy, whose nervous fidgeting revealed a pilfered apple. Thomas's distress, she sensed, was real, but whether it stemmed from guilt or fear was unclear. Craddock flipped a page in his notebook. "We found your fingerprints on the flask, Mr. Reed, which makes sense if you filled it, but we're still waiting on the lab results. Anything else you remember? Anyone lingering near the dressing room?" Thomas hesitated, his eyes darting to Miss Marple, then back to Craddock. "I saw Miss Marsh, Lillian, near the stage door earlier that day. She's always hanging about, bringing gifts. But she wasn't in the dressing room, not that I saw." His voice was steadier now, as if deflecting suspicion gave him purpose. Miss Marple filed the detail away, her mind turning to Lillian's fervent adoration, so like a saint. Mary Mead Widow's obsession with her vicar. Craddock dismissed Thomas, instructing him to remain in town, and the young man left, his shoulders hunched as if carrying a weight. Miss Marple folded her knitting, her expression thoughtful. "A loyal soul, Inspector," she said softly, "but loyalty can curdle when it's taken for granted. In St. Mary Mead, I knew a gardener who turned against his mistress when she overlooked his years of service. Mr. Reed's devotion to Madame Varelli was deep, but I wonder if it was returned." Craddock raised an eyebrow, leaning back in his chair. "You think he's hiding something?" He seemed shaken. "Not cunning, perhaps," Miss Marple said, her eyes distant, "but the shaken ones are often the most revealing." His hands, Inspector, calloused, practical. He's a man of work, not schemes. Yet his pain suggests more than grief. A slight, perhaps, or a betrayal. She thought of the flask, its smudged rim, and the alley door Thomas had mentioned. Small things, she knew, could unravel great mysteries. Craddock nodded, his pencil tapping his notebook. The lab should confirm the poison soon. If it's cyanide, as Haydock thinks, we'll need to trace how it got into that flask. Thomas had access, but so did others. He paused, then added, "You've a knack for seeing what's beneath, Miss Marple. Any thoughts on where to look next?" Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking once more. "At the heart, Inspector." "Always at the heart. Mr. Reed's is heavy, but whether with guilt or sorrow, we must discover. And Miss Beaumont, her ambition is a thread we cannot ignore. Perhaps they intersect." She rose, her small figure resolute, and Craddock escorted her to the door. As she stepped into the street, the theatre's shadow loomed across her path. Miss Marple glanced at it, her mind weaving the threads of Thomas's devotion, Clara's ambition, and the unseen hand that had poisoned Elena's flask. In St. Mary Mead, she had learned that loyalty, like love, could twist into something dark. And Thomas Reed, with his trembling hands and quiet pain, was a thread she would follow to its end. Chapter 6. The Fan's Obsession. The late afternoon light filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, casting delicate shadows across her parlour. She sat by the window, her knitting a soft counterpoint to the ticking of the mantel clock, her mind turning over the events at the Theatre Royal. The death of Elena Varelli, so stark against the opulence of the opera's premiere, had stirred St. Mary Mead's quiet rhythms, much as a dropped stone ripples a still pond. Miss Marple's thoughts now settled on Lillian Marsh, the fervent fan whose devotion to Elena bordered on worship. Her tearful vigil at the theatre, clutching a bouquet of wilting roses, had struck Miss Marple as both poignant and troubling, reminiscent of Mrs. Pike, a St. Mary Mead widow whose fixation on the vicar had once led to an ill-judged act of fervour. Lillian's love, Miss Marple suspected, held clues to the tragedy, if not its cause. Inspector Craddock had telephoned earlier, inviting her to join him at Lillian's modest flat on the edge of the village, where he intended to question her further. Miss Marple, her black shawl draped over her shoulders, stepped into the fading light, her umbrella tapping the pavement as she walked. The flat, a narrow building wedged between a bakery and a haberdashery, was unremarkable, save for the cluster of roses tied to the doorknob. A tribute, Miss Marple guessed, to Elena. She knocked, and Craddock opened the door, his face a mix of determination and faint exasperation. "Miss Marple," he said, ushering her inside. "Miss Marsh is in a state, but she's agreed to talk. I'm hoping you'll spot something in her enthusiasm." His tone held a trace of skepticism, but Miss Marple's gentle smile reassured him. She knew the power of obsession, having seen it in St. Mary Mead's quiet lanes, where a misplaced devotion could unravel lives as surely as any grand passion. Lillian's flat was a shrine to Elena Varelli. The small parlour was crowded with mementos, framed playbills, a silk scarf said to be Elena's, and a glass case holding a signed photograph of the diva, her dark eyes gazing out with imperious grace. On a side table stood a scrapbook, its pages thick with clippings of Elena's performances, letters and ticket stubs. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the scrapbook, noting its meticulous care, like the diary of a saint. Mary Mead spinster, who chronicled every sermon of her beloved vicar. Lillian herself sat on a faded sofa, her hands clasped around a cup of tea, her plain face blotched from crying. Her dowdy coat hung on a rack, and her sensible shoes were neatly aligned by the door, but her eyes burned with a fervour that belied her unassuming appearance. "Miss Marsh," Craddock began, his notebook open, "we need to clarify your movements on the night of the premiere. You said you were in the audience, but you were seen near the stage door earlier that day. Can you explain?" Lillian's hands trembled, tea sloshing in her cup. "I only wanted to see her," she said, her voice a fervent whisper. "Elena, Madame Varelli, was a goddess. I brought her roses, like always, and left them at the stage door. I never went inside, I swear." Her eyes darted to the photograph, as if seeking Elena's approval. And Miss Marple's needles, produced from her bag, clicked softly, a soothing rhythm in the tense room. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice gentle as a lullaby. "You admired Madame Varelli greatly, didn't you, Miss Marsh? It must have been a joy to watch her perform." Her tone was kind, but her eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, caught the flush of Lillian's cheeks, the way her fingers tightened on the cup. "Oh, yes," Lillian breathed, her face lighting up. "Her voice, it was like heaven. I've followed her for years, every performance, every city. I wrote to her, sent gifts, a locket, a scarf, that almond liqueur on her vanity." Her voice faltered, and she looked down, as if realizing the liqueur's mention might raise questions. Miss Marple noted the pause, thinking of Mrs. Pike, whose gifts to the vicar had once included a bottle of homemade cordial, laced with an unwise herb. Craddock seized on the detail. "The liqueur, Miss Marsh." "It was unopened, but you were near the dressing room. Did you see anyone else there? Anyone near the flask Madame Varelli drank from?" Lillian shook her head, her eyes wide. "No, Inspector. I left the roses and went back to my seat. I wouldn't dream of disturbing her, but—" She hesitated, her gaze flickering to Miss Marple, then back to Craddock. "I saw Clara Beaumont in the corridor, near Eleanor's room, before the show. She looked hurried." Her voice held a hint of accusation, and Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind turning to Clara's polished composure, so unlike Lillian's raw emotion. "Miss Beaumont," Craddock repeated, jotting a note. "And what time was this?" "About an hour before curtain," Lillian said, her voice steadier now. "I didn't think much of it then. Clara's always hovering, isn't she, wanting Eleanor's place?" Her tone sharpened, and Miss Marple caught the edge of disdain, like a saint. Mary Mead gossip resenting a rival's rise. Lillian's devotion, it seemed, extended to protecting Elena's legacy, even from her understudy. Miss Marple spoke softly, her eyes on the scrapbook. "Your collection is remarkable, Miss Marsh. Such dedication. Did Madame Varelli ever acknowledge your gifts?" Her question was gentle, but it probed, seeking the heart of Lillian's obsession. Lillian's face softened, a wistful smile breaking through her tears. "She wrote to me once," she said, rising to retrieve a letter from the scrapbook. The paper was creased from handling, its ink faded but legible, thanking Lillian for her support. "She called me her dearest friend," Lillian said, her voice trembling with pride. "I kept every word she sent." Miss Marple nodded, her mind flicking to Mrs. Pike, whose treasured letters from the vicar had fueled a dangerous fixation. Lillian's love, she sensed, was deep but not malicious, yet it might have blinded her to others' deeds. Craddock, his patience thinning, pressed further. "Miss Marsh, you mentioned the stage door. It's often unlocked. Did you notice anyone else there? Anyone who didn't belong?" Lillian frowned, her fingers tracing the letter's edge. "There was a man, a delivery boy, I think, with a parcel. But he left quickly. And the stage hands, of course. They're always about." Her voice was vague, and Miss Marple noted the lack of detail, as if Lillian's eyes had been only for Eleanor. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead girl, so enamoured of a soldier that she missed a thief slipping past her gate. As Craddock continued his questions, Miss Marple rose, her small figure moving to the scrapbook. She turned its pages with care, noting the obsessive detail: newspaper clippings, a pressed flower from Elena's dressing room, a ticket stub from the fatal premiere. The dessus stub, creased and worn, caught her eye. Its edge bore the initials CB in faint pencil. Miss Marple's lips pursed, her mind flashing to Clara Beaumont. Had Lillian picked up the stub by chance, or was it a clue to a deeper connection? She recalled a saint, Mary Mead mystery, solved by a misplaced library card that linked a thief to her crime. "Miss Marsh," Miss Marple said, her voice soft, "this ticket stub, it's from the premiere, yes? How did you come by it?" Her question was casual, as if admiring a keepsake, but her eyes were sharp. Lillian blinked, surprised. I found it near the stage door, after I left the roses. I keep everything of hers." Her voice was earnest, but Miss Marple noted the flush on her cheeks, as if she feared the stub's significance. Craddock, catching Miss Marple's glance, made a note, his brow furrowing. The interview ended, and Craddock instructed Lillian to remain available. She nodded, her eyes returning to Elena's photograph, as if drawing strength from it. Miss Marple, folding her knitting, followed Craddock to the door, her mind weaving the threads of Lillian's story. Outside, the evening air was cool, the theatre's silhouette stark against the twilight. Craddock turned to her, his notebook tucked away. "She's besotted with Varelli," he said, "but I don't see her as a killer." "Too worshipful." Miss Marple nodded, her umbrella tapping the pavement. "Obsession is a powerful thing, Inspector, but it blinds as much as it drives. Miss Marsh sees only Elena, not the shadows around her. Yet her eyes caught Clara, and that stub. Perhaps it's nothing, but in St. Mary Mead, I once found a murderer through a dropped handkerchief." She thought of Clara's hurried presence, Lillian's fervent gaze, and the flask's deadly secret. "Miss Marsh is no murderer, I think, but she may have seen more than she knows." Craddock smiled, accustomed to her cryptic insights. "I'll check the stub for prints." "And Clara, she's piling up in this case." He paused, then added, "You're sure Lillian's not involved?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Sure, Inspector." "I'm never sure until the end, but Miss Marsh's heart is with Elena, not against her. It's the living we must watch, those whose hearts burn with envy or ambition." She glanced at the theatre, its lights dimmed, and thought of Clara, Thomas, and Victor, each a thread in this deadly tapestry. In St. Mary Mead, she had learned that love, even obsessive love, rarely killed, but it could blind one to a killer's hand. And Lillian Marsh, with her roses and her tears, was a witness Miss Marple would not forget. Chapter 7. The Poison's Path. The evening air in St. Mary Mead carried a chill, as if the village itself sensed the shadow cast by Elena Varelli's death. Miss Jane Marple, back in her cosy parlour, sat by the fire, her knitting a steady rhythm, as her mind traced the threads of the mystery at the Theatre Royal. The silver flask with its faint smudge and deadly contents loomed large in her thoughts. Inspector Craddock had telephoned earlier, confirming the coroner's report. Cyanide, swift and lethal, had killed Elena, delivered through the water she sipped during her aria. The how was clear, but the who remained elusive, hidden among the ambitions and obsessions of those around her. Miss Marple, accustomed to unravelling Saint, Mary Mead's quieter scandals, knew that the path to truth lay in the smallest details. A smudge, a glance, a moment's hesitation. Craddock had invited her to the theatre that evening to inspect the stage and its surroundings, hoping her keen eye might uncover what his constables had missed. Miss Marple, her black shawl pinned neatly, arrived as the village clock struck 7, the theatre's facade looming like a silent sentinel under the darkening sky. A constable stood guard at the main entrance, his lantern casting a pool of light on the wet cobblestones. Craddock met her inside, his face etched with the strain of a case that grew more tangled by the hour. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low. "The lab confirmed cyanide in the flask, mixed with the water. No trace in the liqueur bottle, so Miss Marsh's gift is clear, for now. But the flask was handled by too many. Thomas Reed, Clara Beaumont, even a stagehand or two. We're no closer to pinning it down." His tone held a trace of frustration, but his eyes brightened at her presence, knowing her knack for seeing what others overlooked. Miss Marple nodded, her umbrella tucked under her arm as they moved toward the stage. "Poison is a coward's weapon, Inspector," she said softly, her eyes scanning the darkened auditorium. "But it requires cunning, too. In St. Mary Mead, I once knew a woman who slipped laudanum into her rival's tea, not to kill, but to shame. The trick was in the timing, the access. We must find both here." Her voice was gentle, but her mind was sharp, sifting through the suspects' alibis like a seamstress sorting threads. The stage, stripped of its Venetian palazzo backdrop, was a stark expanse of polished wood, littered with props and cables. The prop table, where Elena's flask had rested, stood to one side, its surface cluttered with goblets, a dagger, and a velvet cloak. Miss Marple approached it, her spectacles catching the glow of a nearby lamp. The spot where the flask had lain was marked by a faint ring, as if the silver had left a ghost of itself. She leaned closer, noting a smudge on the table's edge, not unlike the one on the flask. "This mark," she said, pointing delicately. "It's fresh, isn't it?" As if someone set the flask down hurriedly, Craddock crouched beside her, his brow furrowing. Could be. The stage hands move things constantly, but I'll have it dusted for prints. He signalled a constable, who began photographing the table. Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the wings, where a narrow corridor led to the dressing rooms and the alley door. She recalled Thomas Reed's mention of Lillian Marsh near that door, and Clara Beaumont's hurried presence in the corridor. The door itself, rusted and rarely locked, was a silent witness to the comings and goings of the fatal night. "Inspector," she said, her voice thoughtful, "this door to the alley, has anyone checked it for signs of use? A footprint, perhaps, or a trace of mud?" Her question was mild, but it carried the weight of experience, for she had once solved a saint. Mary Mead theft by noting a scuffed boot print near a garden gate. Craddock nodded, leading her to the door. It hung slightly ajar, its hinges creaking in the draught. Outside, the alley was a narrow strip of cobblestones, flanked by bins and a crumbling wall. The constable's lantern revealed a damp patch of ground, but no clear prints, only a faint scrape, as if something had been dragged. Miss Marple's lips pursed, her mind flashing to a saint. Mary Mead burglary, where a dragged sack had betrayed a thief's escape. "Someone may have come this way," she murmured. "Someone who didn't wish to be seen." Back inside, Craddock shared the latest findings. The flask bore Thomas's fingerprints, as expected, but also Clara's, beyond what she'd admitted, and a partial print that might belong to a stagehand. Victor Grayson's alibi held. He'd been in the lighting booth, confirmed by the stage manager, but his movements before the show were less clear. Lillian Marsh, though seen near the stage door, had no prints on the flask, suggesting her role was peripheral. Miss Marple listened, her needles clicking softly, her thoughts weaving a pattern from these fragments. "The poison," she said, her voice almost a whisper, "must have been added close to the performance. Cyanide works quickly, does it not? Whoever did this knew Elena's habits, her ritual of sipping before her aria." She thought of a saint, Mary Mead chemist Mr. Hargreaves, who had once explained cyanide's swiftness, its almond-like scent, a telltale clue. The question is, who had the opportunity and the knowledge? Craddock rubbed his chin, his eyes on the stage. Thomas filled the flask, Clara handled it, Victor was nearby and Lillian was lurking. Any of them could have slipped the poison in, but the timing's tight. The dressing room was a hive of activity, costumers, singers, crew. It's a wonder no one saw anything. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "People see what they expect, Inspector." In St. Mary Mead, a postmistress once missed a thief because she was too busy sorting letters. Here, the chaos of a premiere could hide a careful hand. She paused, her gaze returning to the prop table. "This smudge, these props, they tell a story." Someone touched the flask, perhaps in haste, and left it here, knowing Elena would drink. Craddock followed her gaze, his expression thoughtful. "You think the killer was bold, then? To act in such a crowded place? Bold or desperate?" Miss Marple said, her needles pausing. "In my village, I've seen desperate acts born of envy, fear, or love. Here, we have all three." She thought of Victor's ambition, Clara's hunger for the spotlight, Thomas's wounded loyalty, and Lillian's obsessive devotion. Each could have walked the poison's path, but only one had crossed it. As they moved to the auditorium, Craddock shared a new detail. A torn piece of fabric, caught on a nail near the alley door, had been found that morning. It was green silk, not unlike Clara's costume, though it could belong to another prop. Miss Marple's mind flickered to a saint. Mary Mead dressmaker, whose torn hem had betrayed her presence at a stolen tea party. "Have it examined, Inspector," she said. "It may be nothing, but small things lead to great truths." The theatre grew quiet as the constable's lantern dimmed, and Miss Marple stood on the stage. Her small figure dwarfed by its vastness. She imagined Elena, radiant in her sapphire gown, sipping from the flask, unaware of the poison within. She imagined, too, the killer watching from the shadows, their heart a tangle of motive and malice. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had learned that the path to murder was paved with ordinary moments, a touch, a step, a fleeting choice. Here, in the Theatre Royal, that path was no different, and she would follow it step by careful step until the truth lay bare. Craddock escorted her to the door, his notebook filled with her quiet suggestions. "You've a way of making the impossible seem simple, Miss Marple," he said, a smile breaking through his fatigue. "Any guesses yet?" She adjusted her shawl, her eyes distant. "Guesses, Inspector?" "Number, but observations, yes. The poison's path is clear, but the hand that laid it is not. We must look closer, at the flask, the door, the hearts of those who stood near." She stepped into the night, the theatre's shadow falling behind her, and knew that the next act of this drama would bring her closer to the killer's truth. Chapter 8. A pattern emerges. The morning sun filtered through the mist that clung to St. Mary Mead's quiet lanes, casting a soft glow on the ivy-clad walls of Miss Jane Marple's cottage. She sat at her dining table, a pot of tea steaming beside her, her knitting a gentle rhythm as she reflected on the threads of the Theatre Royal mystery. The cyanide-laced flask, the smudged prop table, the torn green silk near the alley door. These fragments were beginning to form a pattern, much like the intricate lace she crafted with her needles. Miss Marple's mind, honed by years of observing St. Mary Mead's subtle dramas turned to the suspects. Victor Grayson's ambition, Clara Beaumont's envy, Thomas Reed's wounded loyalty, and Lillian Marsh's fervent obsession. Each, she knew, held a piece of the truth, but the shape of the whole remained elusive, like a half-finished quilt. Her nephew, Raymond West, had invited her to dine at his home that evening, eager for her insights into the case that had set the village abuzz. Miss Marple, ever indulgent of Raymond's enthusiasm, arrived at his modern bungalow as dusk settled, her black shawl draped neatly over her shoulders. Raymond, a writer with a flair for the dramatic, greeted her with a grin, his eyes alight with curiosity. "Aunt Jane," he said, ushering her into the dining room, "you've been poking about that opera murder, haven't you? Craddock says you're practically running the show. Tell me everything." Miss Marple smiled faintly, settling into a chair, her knitting bag at her side. "Really, Raymond, you exaggerate," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "I merely observe, as I do in St. Mary Mead. People are much the same, whether in a village or a theatre, full of hopes, fears, and secrets." She sipped her sherry, her eyes drifting to the window, where the theatre's distant silhouette loomed against the twilight. "But a pattern is emerging, and I think we're close to seeing it clearly." Raymond leaned forward, his fork poised over his plate of roast lamb. "A pattern?" You mean you know who poisoned Elena Varelli?" His tone was eager, but Miss Marple raised a delicate hand, her expression serene. "Not know, dear," she said. "Suspect, perhaps." "The truth lies in the details, the flask, the alley door, the torn silk. In St. Mary Mead, I once solved a theft by noticing a mismatched button on a coat. Here we have clues that point to a careful hand, one that knew Elena's habits and seized a moment of chaos." Her needles clicked softly, a counterpoint to her measured words. Raymond, undeterred, pressed for details, and Miss Marple obliged, recounting her observations without revealing too much. She spoke of Victor Grayson's theatrical distress, more concerned with his opera's fate than Eleanor's. Clara Beaumont's polished grief, masking a hunger for the spotlight. Thomas Reed's quiet devotion, tinged with a recent chill from Eleanor, and Lillian Marsh's obsessive love, blind to all but her idol. "Each has a motive," she said, "but motive alone is not enough. We need evidence, and the evidence is speaking." Before Raymond could probe further, a knock at the door announced Inspector Craddock, his face weary but purposeful. He joined them at the table, declining dinner but accepting a cup of tea. "Miss Marple," he said, his grey eyes meeting hers, "I've got news from the lab, and I thought you'd want to hear it in person." The flask had cyanide, no question, mixed into the water, not the liqueur. Clara Beaumont's fingerprints are on it, more than she admitted, and there's a partial print we can't match yet. The green silk from the alley door matches her costume, but it's not conclusive. It could be from a prop. "Miss," Marple's needles paused, her eyes bright behind her spectacles. "Clara's fingerprints, you say? And the silk? Interesting. In St. Mary Mead, a torn apron once led me to a maid who'd stolen silver. The silk may be a thread to follow, Inspector." She thought of Clara's composed demeanour, her quick admission of handling the flask, and the ticket stub Lillian had found, marked with Clara's initials. The pattern, she sensed, was tightening around the understudy. Craddock nodded, his notebook open. "I've checked Grayson's alibi again. The stage manager swears he was in the lighting booth when Elena collapsed. Thomas Reed's story holds too, though his prints on the flask are expected, since he filled it. Lillian Marsh is a puzzle. Her obsession's clear, but there's no evidence she touched the flask. Clara, though, she's the one who keeps cropping up." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind weaving the clues into place. "Clara wanted Eleanor's role," she said softly. "In my village, I knew a girl, Betty the baker's apprentice, who ruined a rival's cake to win a prize. Clara's tears were too perfect, her story too neat. But we must be careful, Inspector. Assumptions are dangerous." She recalled a St. Mary Mead scandal where a hasty accusation had nearly ruined an innocent man. "The silk, the prints, the stub, they point to Clara, but we need more. Have you searched the alley further?" Craddock sighed, rubbing his temple. "We're combing it again tomorrow. That scrape you noticed could be nothing, but I've got men looking for anything out of place. The ticket stub's a problem too. Lillian says she found it, but it's got Clara's initials. Could be a coincidence, or someone's trying to point us her way." Miss Marple's lips pursed, her needles resuming their rhythm. "Coincidences, Inspector, are rare in murder. That stub may be a clue, or a plant. In St. Mary Mead, a dropped letter once led me to a thief who meant to frame another. We must ask Miss Marsh about it again, and Clara too. And the alley, don't overlook it. A muddy boot once solved a burglary for me." Her voice was calm, but her mind was alight, piecing together the smudge on the flask, the silk, the stub, and the suspect's shifting stories. Raymond, listening intently, interjected, "But Aunt Jane, why not Thomas?" He was close to Elena, handled the flask. Maybe she spurned him, and he snapped. His eyes gleamed, as if imagining a novel's twist. Miss Marple smiled, her expression indulgent. "Possible, dear, but unlikely. Thomas's grief feels true, like a gardener I knew who mourned his mistress's scorn but never harmed her. Clara, though, her ambition is a brighter flame. Yet we must test it, not assume it." She turned to Craddock. "Might we arrange a meeting with Clara? Perhaps a rehearsal, where she must handle a flask again. In St. Mary Mead, I once caught a liar by watching her avoid a tampered pie." Craddock's eyes lit up, catching her drift. "A trap, you mean? Get her to show her hand?" He leaned forward, his fatigue giving way to intrigue. "I can set it up. Say we're testing the cast's routines. If Clara hesitates, it might tell us something." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking faster. "Exactly, Inspector. People betray themselves in small ways. A pause, a glance. Clara's careful, but no one's perfect." She thought of the theatre's chaos, the alley's shadows, and the flask's deadly secret. The pattern was clearer now, its lines converging on Clara, but Miss Marple knew better than to trust a half-finished picture. Victor's ambition, Thomas's pain, Lillian's devotion, each could still shift the design. As Craddock left, promising to arrange the rehearsal, Raymond poured his aunt another sherry, his voice awed. "You're like a spider, Aunt Jane, spinning a web to catch the truth. I'll bet you've got the killer pegged already." Miss Marple chuckled, her eyes twinkling. "A spider, Raymond?" "No, just an old woman who notices things. In St. Mary Mead, I've learned that patterns emerge when you look closely, at buttons, boots, or broken hearts. This pattern is forming, and soon we'll see its shape." She sipped her sherry, her mind on the theatre, where the next act of this deadly drama awaited. The truth, she knew, was close, hidden in the ordinary moments of a murderer's choice, and Miss Marple would find it, as she always did. Chapter 9. The Understudy's Mask. The Theatre Royal stood hushed in the pale light of a saint. Mary Mead morning, its grand facade muted by the weight of tragedy. Miss Jane Marple, her black shawl draped over her shoulders, stepped through the stage door, her umbrella tapping softly on the threshold. Inspector Craddock had arranged a staged rehearsal, ostensibly to recreate the fatal night's events. But in truth, it was a trap to test Clara Beaumont, whose fingerprints on the poisoned flask and torn silk near the alley door had drawn Miss Marple's keen scrutiny. Clara's polished grief, so like a saint. Mary Mead debutante, hiding a spiteful act, suggested ambition that burned too brightly to be innocent. Miss Marple, her knitting bag tucked under her arm, knew that truth often slipped through in moments of pressure. Much as a village gossip's lie, unravelled under a neighbour's gentle probing. The auditorium was half-lit, its velvet seats empty, save for a few constables and stagehands. Craddock met her near the orchestra pit, his grey eyes alert despite the shadows beneath them. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low, "we've set the stage as it was before Elena's collapse. Clara's agreed to walk through her movements, and we've placed a new flask on the prop table, filled with water, of course. If she hesitates, as you suggested, it might betray her." He glanced toward the wings, where Clara's emerald costume glimmered, faintly under the stage lights. Miss Marple nodded, settling into a seat near the front, her knitting a soft rhythm in her lap. "People reveal themselves when they're watched, Inspector," she said, her voice gentle but sharp. "In Saint Mary Mead, I once caught a girl stealing jam because she flinched at a jar I'd marked. Clara's careful, but no one's flawless." Her eyes, bright behind her spectacles, scanned the stage, where the props, a goblet, a dagger, a fan, lay in deliberate disarray, mirroring the premiere's chaos. Clara Beaumont emerged from the wings, her dark hair swept into a chignon, her movements graceful but taut, like a cat sensing a trap. She wore her costume, the green silk catching the light, and Miss Marple noted its pristine hem. No tears, unlike the fragment found by the alley door. Clara's face was composed, her smile practiced as she greeted Craddock. "Inspector, I'm happy to help," she said, her voice smooth as polished glass. "Anything to find who did this to Elena?" Her words were sincere, but Miss Marple caught the slight tightening of her lips, reminiscent of a saint. Mary Mead, schoolmistress, caught in a fib about missing chalk. Craddock, notebook in hand, gestured to the prop table. "Miss Beaumont, please show us your routine before the first act. You said you handled Elena's flask during rehearsal. Walk us through it." His tone was neutral, but his eyes were sharp, watching for the hesitation Miss Marple had predicted. Clara nodded, moving to the table with the ease of a seasoned performer. She picked up a script, flipped through it, then reached for the goblet, pausing as her hand hovered near the new flask. Miss Marple's needle stilled, her gaze fixed on Clara's fingers, which trembled faintly before withdrawing. I passed Elena the flask here," Clara said, her voice steady but her eyes flickering to the flask, as if it held a ghost. "She asked for it during the dress rehearsal, to practice her timing." Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice soft as a breeze. "Such a lovely flask, Miss Beaumont. You must have admired it, handling it so often." Her tone was kindly, but her eyes caught the flush creeping up Clara's neck, like a saint. Mary Mead girl blushing over a stolen ribbon. "It was Elena's," Clara said quickly, her smile tight. "I only touched it when she asked." She stepped back, her hands clasping together, and Miss Marple noted the gesture, defensive, like a villager hiding a pilfered apple. The flask remained untouched, its silver surface gleaming under the stage lights, and Miss Marple's mind flashed to a saint. Mary Mead trap, where a marked pie had revealed a thief's guilt by her refusal to taste it. Craddock, catching the moment, pressed further. "And after the rehearsal, you were seen near Elena's dressing room by Miss Marsh. Did you handle the flask then?" His question was direct, and Clara's composure faltered, her eyes darting to the wings as if seeking escape. "I might have passed by," she said, her voice cooler now. "The corridor's busy before a show. Everyone's rushing about." "I didn't go in." Her words were firm, but Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in her hands, the way her gaze avoided the flask. She thought of Betty, the baker's apprentice, whose lies about a ruined cake crumbled when confronted with a witness's testimony. Craddock gestured to a constable, who brought forward the ticket stub Lillian had found, its edge marked with Clara's initials. "This was near the stage door," he said, holding it up. "Miss Marsh says she picked it up after seeing you in the corridor." "Care to explain?" Clara's eyes widened, but she recovered swiftly, her smile returning. "I lose stubs all the time, Inspector." "It's a theatre. Things get dropped, picked up. I don't know how it got there." Her tone was light, but Miss Marple caught the strain in it like a saint. Mary Mead seamstress, denying a torn thread that matched her scissors. Miss Marple spoke, her voice gentle but probing. "It's curious, isn't it, how things find their way to the wrong hands? In my village, a dropped button once led to a thief. You wanted Elena's role, didn't you, Miss Beaumont? It must have been hard, always in her shadow." Her words were soft, but they struck like a dart, and Clara's smile froze, her eyes narrowing. "I admired Elena," she said, her voice tight. "Of course I wanted the lead, who wouldn't? But I'd never harm her." Her hands clenched, and Miss Marple's needles resumed, her mind noting the defiance in Clara's stance, so like a saint. Mary Mead girl caught with stolen sweets but refusing to confess. Craddock dismissed Clara, instructing her to stay in town, and she left the stage, her steps brisk, but her posture rigid. He turned to Miss Marple, his brow raised. "She didn't touch the flask," he said quietly. "You were right. She's nervous about it. And that stub, it's too neat to be chance." Miss Marple folded her knitting, her expression thoughtful. "She's clever, Inspector, but not clever enough. In St. Mary Mead, I knew a girl who avoided a marked trap because she knew it was poisoned, not by taste, but by fear. Clara's fear betrays her, but we need proof. The silk, the prints, the stub, they circle her, but we must close the net." She thought of the alley door, the smudge on the flask, and Clara's hurried presence in Lillian's account. The pattern was nearly complete, but a single thread could still unravel it. Craddock nodded, his notebook tucked away. "I'll have the silk tested again. Maybe it's from her costume after all. And the partial print on the flask, if we can match it, we might have her." He paused, then added, "You've a knack for this, Miss Marple." I'd have missed that hesitation. She smiled, her eyes twinkling. "Insane. Mary Mead, Inspector, I've learned to watch the small things. A flinch, a pause, a lie too smoothly told. Clara's mask is slipping, but we must be sure. The theatre is full of shadows, and we must shine a light on the right one." As they left the stage, the empty auditorium echoed with the weight of her words. And Miss Marple knew that Clara Beaumont, with her polished tears and hidden fears, was a step closer to revealing her truth. Chapter 10. The Fan's Confession. The mist had settled over Saint Mary Mead by late morning, cloaking the village in a soft veil that seemed to hush its usual bustle. Miss Jane Marple sat in her parlour, the fire crackling softly, her knitting a steady rhythm as she pondered the Theatre Royal mystery. The staged rehearsal had tightened the net around Clara Beaumont, whose hesitation near the flask betrayed a fear too sharp for innocence. Yet Miss Marple, ever cautious, knew that a single thread could shift the pattern of a case. Her thoughts turned to Lillian Marsh, the fervent fan whose obsession with Elena Varelli had filled her flat with relics of the diva's life. Lillian's tearful devotion, so like a saint. Mary Mead Widow's fixation on a lost cause had seemed harmless, but her mention of Clara in the corridor and the ticket stub marked with Clara's initials suggested she had seen more than she realized. Miss Marple, her mind as sharp as her needles, resolved to probe further. Inspector Craddock had arranged to meet Lillian at her flat again, hoping to clarify her account of the Premier's chaotic hours. Miss Marple, her black shawl pinned neatly, arrived at the narrow building, noting the fresh roses tied to the doorknob, a silent tribute to Elena. Craddock greeted her at the door, his face lined with the weight of the case. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low, "Miss Marsh is fragile today, but she's agreed to talk. That ticket stub bothers me. It's too convenient, tying Clara to the stage door. I'm hoping you'll spot something in her story." Miss Marple nodded, her umbrella tucked under her arm as she stepped inside. "The smallest details, Inspector, often tell the loudest truths," she said softly, in Saint. Mary Mead, a misplaced hairpin, once revealed a thief's path. Miss Marsh's eyes were on Eleanor, but they may have caught a shadow we need. Her tone was gentle, but her eyes, bright behind her spectacles, missed nothing as they entered Lillian's parlour. The room was unchanged, a shrine to Elena's memory. The glass case with her signed photograph, the scrapbook thick with clippings, the silk scarf draped like a relic. Lillian sat on the faded sofa, her hands twisting a handkerchief, her plain face etched with grief. Her dowdy coat hung nearby, and a new bouquet of roses sat on the table, their scent mingling with the musty air. Miss Marple settled into a chair, her knitting produced from her bag, its soft clicks a soothing counterpoint to Lillian's evident distress. "Miss Marsh," Craddock began, his notebook open, "we need to go over your statement about the premiere. You said you saw Clara Beaumont near Elena's dressing room, and you found a ticket stub by the stage door. Can you tell us exactly what happened?" His tone was firm but kind, aware of Lillian's fragile state. Lillian's eyes flicked to Elena's photograph, as if drawing strength from it. I only wanted to be near her," she said, her voice trembling. "I brought roses, like always, and left them at the stage door, about an hour before the show. I saw Clara in the corridor, near Elena's room. She was moving quickly, holding something, maybe a script, I don't know. I didn't think it mattered then." Her hands twisted the handkerchief tighter, and Miss Marple noted the tremor, like a saint. Mary Mead spinster confessing a minor sin to the vicar. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice gentle as a lullaby. "You loved Madame Varelli dearly, didn't you, Miss Marsh?" It must have been a joy to be so close to her, even for a moment. Her words were warm, but her gaze was sharp, catching the flush of Lillian's cheeks, the way her eyes darted to the scrapbook. "Oh, yes," Lillian said, her voice fervent. "She was everything, her voice, her grace. I'd never hurt her, never." Her eyes filled with tears, and Miss Marple thought of Mrs. Pike, whose adoration for the vicar had blinded her to a scandal brewing under her nose. Lillian's love, she sensed, was a lens that distorted all else. Craddock held up the ticket stub, its edge marked with CB in faint pencil. "This stub, Miss Marsh, you said you found it near the stage door. Can you show us exactly where?" His question was direct, and Lillian's face paled, her fingers pausing on the handkerchief. I picked it up from the ground, just outside the door," she said, her voice faltering. "It was crumpled near the roses. I thought it was Eleanor's, so I kept it." Her eyes dropped, and Miss Marple's needles stilled, her mind flashing to a saint, Mary Mead girl, who kept a stolen trinket, claiming it was a gift. Lillian's story, she sensed, held truth, but also omission. Miss Marple spoke softly, her tone as if musing aloud. "It's curious, isn't it, how things turn up in such places? In my village, a dropped glove once led to a burglar. You were at the stage door, Miss Marsh. Did you see anyone else? A delivery boy, perhaps, or a stranger?" Her question was gentle, but it probed, seeking the edges of Lillian's memory. Lillian frowned, her eyes distant. There was someone, a man, I think, in a cap, carrying a parcel. He slipped into the alley before I could see his face, and the stagehands, always rushing about, but I was focused on Elena. Her voice softened, and Miss Marple noted the sincerity, but also the blindness, like a saint. Mary Mead widow, missing a theft because her eyes were on her idol. Craddock pressed further. "And Clara, did she see you? Did you speak to her?" His notebook was poised, his eyes fixed on Lillian's face. Lillian shook her head, her handkerchief now a tight knot. "No, she didn't notice me. I'm invisible to people like her. She was always hovering near Eleanor, waiting for her chance." Her tone held a faint bitterness, and Miss Marple's mind flickered to Clara's ambition, so evident in her poised demeanour and hesitant hands. Lillian's resentment, though born of loyalty, added another thread to the pattern. Miss Marple rose, her small figure moving to the scrapbook. She turned its pages with care, noting the obsessive detail. A programme from Eleanor's first London performance, a pressed petal from a bouquet, the ticket stub now in Craddock's hands. "You've kept such treasures, Miss Marsh," she said, her voice warm. "This stub, it's special, isn't it?" With Miss Beaumont's initials, it almost seems meant to be found. Her words were gentle, but her eyes caught Lillian's sudden stillness, like a saint, Mary Mead girl caught with a stolen letter. Lillian flushed, her voice rising. "I didn't mean to point at Clara. I just found it, that's all. I'd never hurt Elena. She was my light." Her tears spilled over, and Miss Marple patted her hand, her touch soothing but her mind alert. Lillian's confession, she sensed, was truthful. She had seen Clara, found the stub, but her obsession had clouded her judgment, making her an unwitting witness to a darker act. Craddock closed his notebook, his expression thoughtful. "Thank you, Miss Marsh. We'll need you to stay available." He rose, signalling the end of the interview, and Lillian nodded, her eyes returning to Elena's photograph, as if it held her together. Outside, the mist had thickened, shrouding the theatre's silhouette. Craddock turned to Miss Marple, his brow furrowed. "She's no killer," he said. "Her heart's with Varelli, not against her." But that stub, and seeing Clara, it's piling up against the understudy. Miss Marple adjusted her shawl, her umbrella tapping the pavement. "Miss Marsh is no murderer, Inspector, but her eyes are valuable. In St. Mary Mead, a gossip's idle chatter once led me to a thief. Lillian saw Clara, and that stub ties her to the stage door. It's not proof, but it's a thread we must follow." She thought of Clara's hesitation at the flask, the torn silk, the fingerprints too numerous to excuse. The pattern is clearer now, but we must be certain. Clara's mask is thin, but it's still in place. Craddock nodded, his eyes on the theatre. "I'll have the stub tested for more prints. If Clara's are on it, and we match the silk to her costume, we're close. You've a way of seeing through people, Miss Marple." She smiled, her eyes twinkling. "Insane. Mary Mead, Inspector, I've learned that hearts betray themselves, even when words don't. Lillian's heart is with Eleanor, but Clara's, that's the one to watch." As they parted, the theatre loomed behind her, its secrets closer to the light, and Miss Marple knew that the next step would bring the truth into sharper focus. Chapter 11. The final act. The Theatre Royal stood bathed in the pale glow of St. Mary Mead's street lamps. Its grandeur softened by the mist that lingered into the evening. Miss Jane Marple, her black shawl pinned tightly against the chill, stepped through the stage door, her umbrella a steady tap on the worn threshold. Inspector Craddock had summoned the suspects, Victor Grayson, Clara Beaumont, Thomas Reed and Lillian Marsh, to the theatre for a final confrontation, a carefully staged gathering to unravel the truth behind Elena Varelli's murder. Miss Marple's mind, sharp as the needles in her knitting bag, had woven the clues into a pattern. The cyanide-laced flask, the torn green silk, the ticket stub, and Clara's damning hesitation. Yet she knew from St. Mary Mead's quiet scandals that truth required a nudge to emerge, like a hidden stitch brought to light by a careful hand. The auditorium was dimly lit, its velvet seats empty save for a few constables stationed at the exits. The stage, stripped of its Venetian backdrop, was a stark expanse, the prop table at its centre holding a replica flask, gleaming under the spotlights. Craddock stood by the table, his grey eyes scanning the suspects as they entered, each with a distinct air. Victor, restless and theatrical. Clara, poised but taut. Thomas, hunched and silent. Lillian, clutching a fresh bouquet of roses, her eyes red with grief. Miss Marple settled into a front-row seat, her knitting a soft rhythm, her presence unobtrusive yet commanding, like a village matriarch watching a parish meeting unfold. Craddock began, his voice clear and authoritative. "Thank you for coming," he said, his notebook tucked away, a sign he was ready to close the case. "We've gathered evidence in Madame Varelli's death, and it's time to lay it bare. Cyanide was in her flask, placed there deliberately. One of you knows more than you've told." His eyes swept the group, lingering on Clara, whose composure flickered, her hands clasping tightly. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her eyes missing nothing. Victor's nervous pacing, Clara's rigid posture, Thomas's downcast gaze, Lillian's trembling grip on the roses. She thought of a St. Mary Mead gathering, where a thief's guilt surfaced under the weight of watchful eyes. "The truth," she said, her voice gentle but carrying, "is like a melody. It emerges when the notes align. Let us play them now." Her words, vague yet pointed, drew a glance from Craddock, who nodded, understanding her cue. He turned to the prop table, lifting the replica flask. "This flask," he said, "held cyanide, mixed with water Madame Varelli drank before her aria. Thomas Reed filled it that morning, as was his duty. His fingerprints confirm it, but Clara Beaumont's prints were also found. More than a single touch would explain." Clara's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing, but she said nothing, her lips a thin line. Craddock continued, holding up the ticket stub. "This was found by Miss Marsh near the stage door, marked with Miss Beaumont's initials. And a piece of green silk, matching Miss Beaumont's costume, was caught on a nail by that door. Miss Marsh saw you, Clara, near Elena's dressing room, moving quickly an hour before the show." His voice was steady, but the accusation hung heavy, and Clara's face paled, her hands clenching. Victor interjected, his voice sharp. "This is outrageous! Clara's a professional, not a murderer. I was in the lighting booth. You've checked my alibi." His hands flailed, but Miss Marple noted his quick defence of Clara as if shielding his own interests. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead Grocer, who defended a guilty clerk to protect his shop's reputation. Thomas, his voice low, spoke up. I filled the flask, yes, but I never touched it after. Elena was distant, but I'd never harm her. His glasses slipped, and he adjusted them, his hands trembling. Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind noting his sincerity so like a saint. Mary Mead Gardiner, whose loyalty survived a mistress's scorn. Lillian, tears spilling, clutched her roses. Elena was my light. I only wanted to honour her. I saw Clara, yes, but I'd never accuse without proof. Her voice broke, and Miss Marple thought of a saint, Mary Mead Widow, whose devotion blinded her to a friend's deceit, but not to the truth she witnessed. Miss Marple rose, her small figure commanding the stage's attention. Ambition, she said softly, her eyes on Clara, is a potent poison. In St. Mary Mead, I knew a seamstress who sabotaged a rival's gown to win a commission. The act was small, but the heart was the same. She stepped forward, her voice calm but piercing. Miss Beaumont, you wanted Elena's role. Your fingerprints, the silk, the stub, they point to you. And when we asked you to touch a flask again, you flinched, as if it burned. Clara's composure shattered, her voice rising. This is absurd. I admired Elena. Yes, I wanted her role. Who wouldn't? But I didn't kill her. Her eyes darted to the flask, her hands trembling, and Miss Marple saw the fear, like a saint. Mary Mead girl caught with stolen sweets, her denial crumbling under scrutiny. Craddock stepped closer, his tone firm. The lab matched the silk to your costume, Miss Beaumont. Your prints on the flask show you handled it more than once. And a witness, Miss Marsh, places you near the dressing room where the cyanide was added. You knew Elena's ritual, her aria. You had the chance and the motive. Clara's face crumpled, her hands covering her mouth. I didn't mean, she stammered, then stopped, her eyes wide with panic. The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Miss Marple's needles stilled, her mind flashing to a saint. Mary Mead confession, where a thief's half-spoken truth unravelled her guilt. You studied poisons, Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but unrelenting. In your script, I saw notes on timing, precise, calculated. Cyanide is swift, as you knew. You slipped it into the flask, knowing Elena would drink before her aria, knowing you'd take her place. Her words were soft, but they cut, and Clara sank to her knees, her sobs echoing in the empty theatre. I only wanted my chance, Clara whispered, her voice breaking. She was always the star, always above me. I studied cyanide for a play years ago. It was so easy, just a pinch in the flask during the chaos. I didn't think. Her confession trailed off, and Craddock signalled a constable, who gently restrained her. Victor Pale stepped back, his hands raised as if distancing himself. Thomas stared, his glasses fogging with unshed tears. Lillian dropped her roses, her sobs mingling with Clara's. Miss Marple watched, her expression serene but tinged with sadness, for she knew the cost of human weakness, seen too often in St. Mary Mead's quiet lanes. Craddock turned to her, his voice low. You saw it all along, didn't you, Miss Marple? The pattern, the truth. She shook her head, her needles resuming their rhythm. Not all along, Inspector. But in St. Mary Mead, I've learned that hearts betray themselves. In a glance, a pause, a tear too few. Clara's ambition was her mask, but it slipped. She thought of the flask, the silk, the stub. all small threads in a deadly tapestry, now complete. As Clara was led away, the theatre's silence deepened, its stage a witness to a tragedy ended. Miss Marple folded her knitting, her eyes on the empty seats, and knew that justice, though served, brought no joy, only the clarity of truth, as sharp and fragile as the notes of Elena's final aria. Chapter 12. The Curtain Falls. The mist had cleared from St. Mary Mead by morning, leaving the village bathed in a crisp autumn light that seemed to promise renewal. Miss Jane Marple sat in her garden, her black shawl draped over her shoulders, her knitting a gentle rhythm as she tended to her roses. The Theatre Royal's tragedy had reached its denouement, with Clara Beaumont's confession unveiling the bitter ambition that had poisoned Elena Varelli's final performance. Yet, as Miss Marple clipped a wilted bloom, her mind lingered on the case, its echoes resonating with the small but sharp dramas of her village. In St. Mary Mead, she had learned that truth, though triumphant, often left a quiet ache, like a melody fading into silence. The village was abuzz with talk of the murder, the tea-rooms and shops humming with speculation. Miss Marple, however, preferred the solitude of her garden, where she could sift through the case's final threads. Clara's arrest had closed the investigation, but the motives, ambition, loyalty, obsession reminded her of St. Mary Mead's own tangled hearts. She thought of Victor Grayson, now free but tarnished by scandal, Thomas Reed, whose devotion had been tested but not broken, and Lillian Marsh, whose love for Elena would forever haunt her. Each, in their way, had been touched by the poison's shadow, and Miss Marple, ever compassionate, felt a pang for their losses. Raymond West arrived for tea, his writer's curiosity undimmed by the case's resolution. He settled into a wicker chair, his eyes bright with questions. "Aunt Jane," he said, pouring himself a cup, "you've done it again." Cracked a murder case that had Craddock stumped. "How did you know it was Clara?" "I'd have bet on Victor, with all his bluster." His tone was admiring, but Miss Marple waved a delicate hand, her smile faint. "Really, Raymond, it's not about knowing, it's about seeing," she said, her voice soft as the breeze stirring her roses. "In St. Mary Mead, I've watched people's hearts, their envies, their fears. Clara's ambition was like a girl I knew, Betty, who spoiled a rival's cake to win a prize. The signs were there. Her fingerprints, her hesitation, the silk from her costume. Small things, but they told a story. Her needles clicked, a steady counterpoint to her words. Raymond leaned forward, his tea forgotten. "But Lillian's ticket stub, Thomas's grief, you didn't suspect them. Or Victor, with his big plans." His questions were eager, and Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "Lillian loved too fiercely to kill," she said, "like a widow in my village who adored her vicar but never harmed his critics. Thomas's pain was real, like a gardener I knew, hurt but loyal. Victor, his ambition was loud but not deadly. Clara, though, her calm was a mask, and masks always slip." She thought of the staged rehearsal, Clara's flinch at the flask, and the green silk caught on the alley door's nail. In St. Mary Mead, a torn hem once betrayed a thief. Here it was Clara's silk, her prince, her fear. Inspector Craddock had sent a note earlier, confirming Clara's full confession. She had slipped cyanide into the flask during the pre-show chaos, knowing Elena's ritual of drinking before her aria. The poison, sourced from a chemistry book she'd studied for a play, was a calculated choice, its swiftness ensuring Clara's rise to the lead role. The ticket stub dropped in her haste had been an accident, but Lillian's sharp eyes had caught it, sealing Clara's fate. Miss Marple, reading the note, had nodded, seeing the pattern complete, like a quilt stitched with care. Raymond sipped his tea, his expression awed. "You make it sound so simple, Aunt Jane." "But what now? The theatre's a mess. The opera's cancelled. Will you take on another case?" His grin was teasing, but Miss Marple's smile was serene. "The theatre will recover, dear," she said, clipping another rose. "Art endures, even after tragedy. As for cases, I prefer my garden, where the puzzles are smaller but no less human." She thought of Elena's voice, silenced forever, and Clara's ambition, now a chain. In Saint Mary Mead, I've learned that justice heals, but it doesn't erase. We must live with what's left. As Raymond chatted on, promising to bring her to more premieres, Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the theatre's distant spire, just visible over the village rooftops. The curtain had fallen on this drama, but others she knew waited in the wings of Saint Mary Mead of Human Hearts. She returned to her knitting, the needles a soft rhythm, and let the village's quiet embrace her, ready for the next puzzle that life, in its inevitable way, would bring.